Hi friends, Molten here and welcome back to my Journey to GM series. So in today's video I'm going to cover one of my most memorable games, and which was one I played in Gibraltar Masters of 2008. So if you've seen my videos before, you've seen that I played this tournament previously and I reached the final round needing to win with the white pieces in order to get my third and final international master norm. I went for a King's Gambit and stuffed it up at the very end, which could have costed me the Brilliancy prize for that event. So I found myself in the exact same situation in the last round, again having to win with the white pieces. I played e4, e5, this time against Viktor Mikalevsky, who is an opponent I've previously lost to with the black pieces. And in a must-win situation, of course I'm going to go for my most favorite opening, and it is the King's Gambit. So we have f4. My opponent played bishop c5, which is also known as the King's Gambit declined. Knight f3, pawn to d6. So black's idea is to cover this diagonal so I'm unable to castle very easily. So pawn to c3, we're threatening to play d4 perhaps and block this diagonal. Knight f6 was played. Now d4 is one of the main lines in this position, but I opted for something a little less known, which is pawn takes on e5, pawn takes, and knight takes e5 instead. So after this move, castles was played, which is a very good move by black, just further developing his pieces. d4 now, knight takes e4, and in this position I was still familiar with it because I'd seen a game played by David Bronstein, one of my favorite players, especially in the King's Gambit. And in this position the game continued queen to d3, and the opponent played queen to h4, and I was going to continue with the move pawn to g3 here, takes, and follow the game, which went queen e4 check, king f2, queen takes rook, and white got a winning attack after bishop h6, g6, and we're picking up the bishop as well as the rook. We can just take the bishop first and white is completely winning. But of course my opponent didn't do this, and after queen to d3 found a much better move, which is the move bishop to f5. So also note that he can't, in this position back here, we can't take because black would just take and then knight f2 check will pick up the rook. But after bishop f5, we were both out of what we were familiar with because we both spent a lot of time here, especially after queen f3. My opponent was down from 90 minutes on the clock to only 7 minutes, and we're not even on move 10. After queen f3 there's a lot of consideration I think he was giving to bishop takes d4, pawn takes d4, and queen takes d4, which is a possible idea, but I don't think it quite works in this position since the bishop is unguarded and probably white is doing okay just taking everything. So instead, after queen f3, g6 was played after a long think, and here we have the move bishop to c4. Again, bishop takes d4 is a consideration, but bishop takes c4 now, takes, I don't think quite works because white has ideas such as bishop takes f7 as well to go for some counter sacrifices here. So bishop c4, bishop d6 was played, and here as white we need to go for something very concrete, put pressure on these pieces, so g4 is the move that makes most sense. Queen h4 check was played, king goes to f1, not really a problem if you're a King's Gambit player because the king often moves anyway in these positions. So bishop takes e5, we have pawn takes on f5, knight goes to d6, bishop drops back to b3, bishop goes to g7, I captured here on g6, pawn takes, and rook g1. So the idea is to play the move rook takes g6. For example, queen here, I just take the pawn with an attack along the g file. Therefore, black played the move rook e8. So black is playing very active moves here, trying to create some counterplay, which is the correct way you should respond to an attack. I don't have time to take here because rook check. I played the move bishop to e3 to block, but in fact I should just play bishop f4, attacking the knight, which was my first instinct, but then something spooked me about rook e1 check, even though there's not quite enough checks Even if queen check, for example, rook check, I just go king to h1 and king's perfectly safe here. So there's nothing for black. Instead, after bishop to e3, king f8 was played, and then I went for bishop f2. So black can't take because rook h1 traps the queen. So queen h6 to stop knight d2, knight a3. So my idea is to play knight b5 here, hitting the pawn, hitting the knight, and also hitting this pawn on f7, going for some checkmating threats. Knight d7 actually allows knight to b5. So I thought this was a very clever move. I thought initially thought it was just a blunder, and then I realized my opponent's idea was just to sacrifice the exchange, the rook entirely. So you'll see after knight b5, he can't take because of the mate, but instead it just plays knight f6. Knight takes e7, and black plays a really good move in this position, and it just says take my rook in the corner, and plays rook to e4, threatening rook f4, knight e4, and just going for a direct counterattack. So you see both players here are going for counterplay as opposed to trying to defend. Bishop g3 was played, so defending this square, hitting the knight, knight f5. Now I accept the rook sacrifice because you should accept the sacrifice if you want to try and refute it. Knight e3 check. We're both down to very, very low time here because we've spent pretty much all our time in the first 15 moves. So at this point I believe it's already like a blitz game. In this position, white has two moves. I played the incorrect move, I believe. So I should have played king f2. This was slightly more accurate, since now if the knight checks, let's say this knight checks, I can run to g2 and run this way. Whereas if this knight checks like this, then the rook is undefended in a lot of positions. So when I move my king, I can often just recapture the rook if the knight moves. So instead I played king e2, and after knight check I played queen takes e4. I think here I could have considered this, or maybe in the previous variation I could have gone king here instead of this one. Anyway, I gave away my queen in this position. After queen takes e4, he played queen check. King went back. Knight takes, so now there's a threat of checkmate on e3. So we played bishop takes on c4. Queen takes b2. Now position gets very, very messy. So I have a lot of pieces for the queen, but it's a matter of whether we can get this knight safely into the game. So if this knight remains stuck, then we're just a little bit short on pieces. So the rest of the game is trying to get that knight into play. So rook d1 is trying to stop knight check. So knight check, we give up the rook. So now we have 3 pieces for the queen. So it's okay, it's just our king is a bit misplaced and our knight is trapped. Bishop check. King goes back. If king goes this way, then we happily bring our knight into the game with check. Okay, so rook g3 was played, so we can't take this pawn because black has all sorts of checking ideas, such as this, and picking up the rook on g6. So rook g3 was played. b5, interesting move by my opponent. The idea is that if I capture the pawn, then black will go for one of these two and try to create a passed pawn. At the moment, black doesn't have any passed pawns. So after bishop b3, it goes b4. Bishop takes. So that's trying to displace the bishop from the defense of h2. And now after queen takes h2, black does have a passed pawn here, which he can try and push. Rook to f3. So that was blocking queen h1 check and picking up the knight. Queen h1 check anyway. King f2. Bishop to f6. So in this position, I thought there's no way for black to defend this pawn on f7, and then I was probably winning. after bishop takes or rook takes, but then black finds a very good defensive resource once again. So bishop to f6, bishop to d5. So I can't take because queen h4 check, king e2. So now the plan is march the king up the board, move the knight into the game, and win with the 3 pieces. But now we have to worry about this g pawn as well. And at some point in this game, I think black also had a way where he could possibly have won a piece around about here, but we were both very low on time, so the moves weren't 100% accurate from both sides. So white's trying to win here. So yeah, we're trying to march the king up the board, trying to get the knight into the game. But this pawn is getting very dangerous. Rook g2, bishop d8. Again, a nice move. So black is finding very good resources here to just shut our knight down. Our knight can't move again because queen check picks up the knight. So bishop d5 was played. King goes to f6, rook goes back. Queen goes to f5. Already I didn't really see a way to make progress, and maybe queen f2 is coming, or some ideas like this, like queen maybe threatening to go check and check here. So I have to be a little bit careful here. So I decided to just take the pawn. Queen f4, my idea was to go king d7. So here if queen takes rook, we have king takes here, and we know that 3 pieces are very, very strong against the queen, and in this position white should just be winning with the 3 extra pieces because the knight is escaping and also these pawns are ready to push up the board. So after king d7, instead, to my surprise, my opponent didn't take the rook and played this move queen to f5, which I had completely overlooked, because in this position now I can't take the bishop because queen takes d5 would hit my knight, and I don't think that is a viable winning try with just 2 pieces against the queen. So instead I had to play king to d6, and we had a repetition of moves after queen f4 check, king d7 and queen f5 check. A draw was agreed. So this was I think a good game by both sides. We got a very interesting position and we both had chances, and this game ended up winning both of us a shared Brilliancy prize, and this was the first time I ever got one.